Alright guys, time to talk about how we get energy when there's no oxygen involved, and that is through fermentation or anaerobic respiration. Now, it's important to remember that anaerobic respiration happens without oxygen. It is not in the presence of oxygen. But it's not just glycolysis. Remember we said glycolysis happens in the cytosol of the cell, and then the following parts of cellular respiration continue on into the mitochondria, but glycolysis isn't the only part of fermentation. There's also glycolysis and then alcohol or lactic acid fermentation. So there's two main types that we're going to be talking about today. Now, when we're talking about our alcoholic fermentation, we're going from one glucose molecule and we're turning it to two pyruvic acids and then carbon dioxide and alcohol. With lactic acid, our different outputs are, of course, lactic acid. So the important thing is that fermentation is going to show up when we have a problem. We cannot get our NADH reoxidized. So glycolysis will stop, which is step 6, and because there is no NAD+, we cannot continue the process. So this is the main idea of why we can't continue with our normal cellular respiration. Our NADH is not reoxidized, and so glycolysis will stop at our 6th step. Now, we need fermentation to reoxidize our NADH, and then glycolysis will continue. And fermentation is going to consist of glycolysis plus the reactions that regenerate our NAD+. So, our two main types are, of course, alcoholic and lactic acid. It's occurring in the cytosol, of course, not in the mitochondria of the cell. So, some of the organisms that do lactic acid fermentation are bacteria, like Streptococcus bacteria, Lactobacillus. We actually do anaerobic respiration as well, and we do lactic acid when we run out of an adequate supply of oxygen to supply our muscles with the energy that they need. So, there are other types of fermentation as well, such as mixed acid fermentation, acetone and butanol fermentation, homolactic and heterolactic acid fermentation, and these are just lots of different types that we will see that different types of bacteria will do. Now, fermentation is really important just for industry and purposes of human lifestyle. This is how we get things like beer, wine, pickles, and then, of course, the carbon dioxide produced by yeast rising is also used, by yeast respiring is also used to make bread rise. Of course, these are some other types of fermentation as well, our acetone and butyric acid fermentation. Whoops! The important thing to remember is that at the end of fermentation, we are only going to get the 2 ATP that were generated initially in glycolysis. Now, of course, the process continues after glycolysis, but these 2 ATP are the only energy that will occur. Or the only energy molecules that will occur out of the entire process. Whoops! So we will see fermentation happening in small microbes and generally organisms with that have slower growth. Fermentation is not efficient enough to provide the energy for larger organisms. Now, in alcoholic fermentation, we're going to have our pyruvate losing carbon dioxide and to create a 2-carbon acetaldehyde, and then our NADH is oxidized and our acetaldehyde is reduced, so we can create our NADH. Remember, with every oxidation, there has to be a reduction as well. So our NADH will lose an electron and give it, of course, to our acetaldehyde. In lactic acid fermentation, this, again, we'll see in us, we'll see in other small vertebrates. NADH is oxidized, of course, to NAD+, and our pyruvate is reduced to lactate, which will then create our lactic acid. So again, the most important takeaway you need to have from fermentation is that there is only 2 ATP generated in this process. And here's a yeast. I forgot to show you my yeast. Yeast do it. Yay! We're dead.